This week is neuro-monitoring, so welcome back to week 2 of our series on Every NICU is a Neuro-NICU. We're going through the 4 pillars of neuro-NICU care. Last week, in week 1, we went through neuro-assessment, we went through the what, why, and how to set up a neuro-NICU program, and then this week we're going to dive into brain monitoring, my favorite topic, aEEG. Go ahead, click the link in the show notes below so that you can get the workbook that goes with this, as well as free CEU credit. Next week for week 3, we'll be talking about neuroprotective strategies, things you can do every day at the bedside. And of course, we'll be talking about therapeutic hypothermia as well. Week 4 will be all about neurodevelopment, so don't miss that here on our channel. If you want to be notified when the sessions go live, go ahead and hit the like button and subscribe so that YouTube knows that you want to see more of our content. Let's dive into part 2 of Every NICU is a Neuro-NICU and all the things you need to know about using aEEG and a little bit about NIRS in your NICU. I'll see you at the end. Bye. All right. Welcome back. And we're going to jump into neuromonitoring, one of my favorite topics. So I started teaching about neuromonitoring in about 2005. I was introduced to the BrainZ device, which is no longer even being sold. But it was a really fun time in my career to learn so much about neuromonitoring, which I didn't really even give it much thought before that. And so probably most of you have been doing this for a while. And when you first started seeing these bedside brain monitors, you were unsure if they were going to be really that helpful. And when I first learned about aEEG, I really think about this baby her name is baby Maggie, and she was a 5-day-old who was admitted to our NICU. And baby Maggie was admitted for apnea. She was one of those little term babies who ends up with apnea at home and was a little hyperbilly. And she came from a community hospital to where I was working at the time at the tertiary center. And she was readmit from home from a peds unit. And so for our NICU, we put her in the isolation. And so I took care of her for 5 days straight in isolation. And around day 3, I started noticing that she was more lethargic and she really wasn't doing so well. And she wasn't eating as well. And you know how it is when you're in isolation with one baby, you get to really know them well. And so I started convincing the fellow to order an EEG or to get a neuroconsult. Like things were just not right. Her fontanelle was bulging. She was lethargic. Just things were not adding up. And so I annoyed him so much through the whole weekend that he agreed on Monday he would order an EEG. And we did. And as soon as the tech came, this baby was in status on the EEG. And when I first learned about aEEG and bedside brain monitoring, this baby came to mind because I wondered how long she had been in status. I wondered how long she had been, just sitting there suffering, her brain suffering. And I wondered if I had had a bedside tool that I could have used if I would have seen it sooner. She ended up having E. coli meningitis. She ended up being on 3 weeks of antibiotic at super meningitic doses. And she ended up having intractable seizures that we were on for SED drips, and it was a crazy few days with her. And we lost her to follow-up. Her parents were PhD students at UC Riverside, and they went back to China, and we didn't get to follow her up. And so I always wondered what happened to this baby, Maggie. So brain monitoring has a really special place in my heart because I really believe that these bedside tools are really for those of us who live and work in the NICU every single day. And let's talk then about these monitors. So what devices do we use to monitor a sick baby in the NICU? Probably a lot of you have seen me give this slide before. Well, we do temperature monitoring, end-tidal CO2, saturation monitors from 1 or 2 sites, heart rate monitoring, blood pressure monitoring, invasive, non-invasive. But what about the brain? Until we started having these bedside brain monitors, we were not monitoring the brain, the organ that is responsible for our quality of life. And so this kind of brain monitoring is really so important. So brain monitoring, what is it? Number 1, it's a complementary tool at the bedside. It is not about replacing anything that we do. This isn't about replacing the neuro exam. This isn't about replacing conventional full EEGs or our neuro exams or our neuro assessments from our neuro colleagues. This is about a complementary tool at the bedside to give us continuous information about the impact of the care and the health of the brain. We use it in conjunction with other things, again, not as a replacement. It's not a diagnostic tool. These are all just screening tools that we use to help guide our care. But what I love about it is it provides us with unit-based information in real time. So you can literally give a medication and see an impact on the brain. You can literally provide a care and see the impact on the brain and the brain status. So when we talk about brain monitoring devices, we really have two groups of devices. We have brain function monitors, so looking at the actual brain electrical activity, and we have brain perfusion monitoring or oxygen delivery, so we can look like a pulse ox. And we're going to spend most of the time on the brain function monitors because I think that these are more prime time than the brain perfusion, but know that there are many applications, many uses, and many places that are definitely using NIRS as part of their standard of care. So continuous video EEG is still one of the best tools that we have for evaluating brain function at the bedside. It is the gold standard for seizure detection, and it definitely does help us with seizures that are undetectable by the eye. And we know that neonatal seizures, about 80 to 90% of them can be subclinical. And that meaning that we see with our eyes nothing, just like that baby Maggie that I took care of where we saw nothing and where we had a brain that was seizing and seizing. Many medications that we give cause what's known as an uncoupling. So we give a medication, the brain continues to seize, but the body stops seizing. So this electrical mechanical dissociation that we oftentimes see. When we're talking about full video, continuous EEG, electrode application and interpretation are typically required by our experts. So neurophysiologists, neurology, EEG techs, people like that to get these on and to keep them on. One of the things that I want people to know is that many times unless you're in a unit that has true telemetry, we are oftentimes really only getting the interpretation done intermittently at best. So by the ACNS guideline, that's the American Clinical Neurophysiology Society, their guidelines recommend that EEG is reviewed at least within the first 2 hours after application, and then at a minimum twice daily. Now, most places are able to meet that standard, if not exceed that standard, but that is the minimum standard for neurophysiology. Although we may have continuous recording at the bedside, if you don't use trending software to help you interpret it in an easy way at the bedside, that is the best that you're getting. You're just getting a continuous recording at the cost of about $8,000 to $10,000 a day, and you're not getting a continuous reading. And so this is where trending software, using things like quantitative EEG, which we're going to talk about aEEG specifically, really gives us power at the bedside and helps to minimize some of these disadvantages that we see with the full EEG. So what is aEEG? It's a simplified EEG. It's a trended EEG. We're going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute, and it gives an overall impression of cerebral activity. The advantages are it's easy to use, requires minimal interference. Once you get the electrodes in, they work pretty well, and less training is required for interpretation. The problem is it's a local view of the brain. We may miss some seizures. It's really a localized view, and it takes time for staff to gain competency in application as well as interpretation, which is why we're going to spend time on this today. One of the disadvantages of a conventional EEG that you see here on the left is really how complex it is and how much information we see on the screen. And so this is an example of a 16-channel EEG, and we'll talk about what a channel means, but basically it's a pair of electrodes on the head. And we place them on the left and we place them on the right, and this is 10 seconds of EEG data, lots of detail. Compare that then to a simplified view of amplitude integrated EEG. This is just 2 channels, so just 2 of these squiggly lines, one from the left and one from the right. I'm displaying the raw EEG here at the top, and then a time compressed amount of EEG on the bottom. And so in this example, we have 10 seconds of EEG either on the left or at the top of these panels. And then here we have a trend of aEEG that's 3.5 hours. So when we talk about that's brain function, now we'll talk about brain perfusion. Near-infrared spectroscopy, better known as NIRS, is continuous real-time non-invasive way to measure regional oxygenation. So if we put a probe over the scalp on the forehead, we're looking at brain waves or brain saturation. If we're putting it over the kidneys, we're looking at renal saturations. If we're looking over the abdomen, maybe you have a baby who has gastroschisis and you're looking for compartment syndrome, you can put a probe across the abdomen and look for perfusion of those tissues as well. So it's a regional end organ saturation monitor, which I think is really cool. The cerebral sats are actually validated against jugular venous saturation. So unlike our pulse ox, which we would have on a hand or a foot, which is measuring arterial saturations, the NIRS probes actually are measuring a mixed saturation. So it's a partial venous and partial arterial. And so the values are not a 1-for-1 that you would see at your pulse ox. It may say 92, and at the brain, it might say 72. That means that there's a mixed saturation and there's some extraction of oxygen that's happening between these two areas. Or it may mean that there is a decrease in perfusion to that area as well. And that gets a little more complicated and sometimes hard to distinguish what's really happening. But just realizing these are mixed saturations. So there are some reports that showing a high cerebral saturation in the first 24 hours for babies undergoing cooling actually are showing poor neurodevelopmental outcome. But there is a fair amount of research looking at cardiac babies and looking at the kind of threshold of what we consider to be a low oxygen saturation. So at Stanford, where I do some consulting, we consider a cerebral sat less than 50 to be our critical value, where we begin to alert people before we get down to the range of 40, where we know from animal studies there may be damage to those neurons. So again, every hospital is using them differently, and depending on how much you want to invest in the technology, there are definitely a lot of research happening and much more coming in the years to come here. And a very cool tool. It's a very critical thinking tool. You have to really take into account the baby's blood pressure, the baby's oxygen status, hemoglobin, his hematocrit, how much oxygen support they're on. So all of those things go into really analyzing the use of NIRS. And I love some of the newer tools that are coming out where you can see all the vital signs, including your neurovitals, all on one screen, so that you can really begin to trend these things together. Because I think the number in isolation is a little hard to interpret. You kind of need to look at the whole picture to be able to know whether high is good in this case or high is bad in another case. And so I think that it becomes a little more complicated than just this is good and this is bad. It's not like a regular pulse ox. It can be a little more than that. All right, so let's talk about what does neuromonitoring tell us. So neuromonitoring, first off, if we're talking about brain function, it's going to tell us about the actual brain activity. What's the amount of background activity, how much sleep is happening, and whether there are seizures or not seizures. And really, in the end, these are really the three things that we want to evaluate: background, sleep, and seizures. We know that these things are the things that correlate to outcome. Brain function monitors and neuromonitoring in general can help tell us predict outcome, especially in our babies with HIE, and really beginning now to have a lot more data on preterm babies as well. We can see that response to medical treatment. So whether that's seizure treatment or whether or not we're actually doing things, maybe trying to get a shunt placed for babies, or maybe even like our cardiac babies where we start to see a loss of sleep-wake cycling. So earlier interventions aiming on improving outcome. So using this brain function to really tell us more of the story. Then we have brain perfusion. So brain perfusion can tell us about just that hemodynamics of the brain, oxygenation status of the brain. Again, some data coming now to help us predict outcome. Also, again, response to treatment and helping us to intervene to improve outcome. So some of the things that you guys said about challenges to monitoring, number one is how to read aEEG. So we're going to spend time doing that. And number two, how to apply the leads. And so of course, every baby, and someone just emailed me yesterday saying, Kathy, how do you keep these needles in when there's so much hair? So there's always something that we need to work on with these leads. So we'll talk a little bit about those. So tell me in your practice, first off, are you using aEEG? And then the second is, what kind of sensors are you using in your NICU? What are the most popular? So somebody's purchased the aEEG, but they haven't started using it yet. Hydrogels. Great. So good mix. So these are the kind of the most typical answers. And so I wanted to just share this slide that Dr. Mohammed Al-Dib showed in a meeting. And I loved this because I thought I've never seen anybody really put this together this way before. Talking about the highest quality being the needle electrodes, because you really do have extremely low impedance, a very stable tracing, to the least invasive, but sometimes the least quality, depending on how well it sticks. So we definitely have the needles. These are very low impedance, but high invasiveness. Then we have the cups and discs. They might be reusable. They might be disposable. Then we have hydrogels. Then we have these self-sticky little spider, I'm going to go call these little octopus arms or something, and then caps. So these are two different kinds of caps that we are now seeing on the market as well. Lots of options. There's really no right or wrong on which electrodes to use. And it just ends up being, if you're not using them as frequently, sometimes the ready to go, already put together easy caps are better for places. Sometimes the needles are better if you need to get them in very quickly. So they're really, again, there is no right or wrong. There's really no risk to the baby one way or the other. Somebody's saying they had problems with needle sticks. Yeah, that is definitely a con to needles, is that they can fall out and then they have a needle in the bed. And so you need to be very careful with that. And that is a definite reason that some places don't use needles at all. One of those things to keep in mind. All right. So some of the things to think about if you are going to start using EEG, or if you have an aEEG monitor and you are not yet using it, like you said, it's sitting in the closet. Here are some things to really think about. First off is to decide what kind of monitor you're going to buy. So some of you already have monitors, some of you are looking at monitors, some of you, the decision's already been made. But know that there are different kinds of monitors, and I've broken it down into 3 categories. Just the standalone aEEG, which is for the most part, most people are buying the CFM or the OBM from Natus. Then you have regular EEGs in the middle that have an aEEG display. So these are going to be things like your neon codon, your Nicolay, maybe lifelines. Those kinds of devices are the most popular that we see in the children's hospitals and in pediatrics. And then there are some new monitors called multimodal that are by themselves EEG or aEEG monitors, but also pipe in the data from these other devices. So on one screen, you can see something like the aEEG, the NIRS, the heart rate, the blood pressure, all in one place. And so it makes interpretation of all the variables really nice. So once you've picked your monitor, you need to gather your team. And there are a lot of people that need to be involved in getting an aEEG program going. You've got your bedside providers, your medical team, nursing administration, your educators, and maybe you've got your unit clerk or parent rep helping with maybe a handout for parents. And then you've got other people like neurology, neurophysiology, your IT department, and your EEG lab, central supply, purchasing. Where are you going to store all this stuff? Who's going to order it? Who's going to stock it? And on. Once you've got all that worked out, I think one of the most important steps is really the electrode application. Who's going to apply them, what, when, and where? So I think who will place them typically tends to be the nurse's job, but other places that can be the physician's job, might be a fellow if you are at a training institution, or it may be even in some places it's the RT because they're available and they can do procedures like that for babies. So they have a lot of experience from sleep study or from sleep labs, and they can be great resources as well. But typically it's the nurses who apply electrodes. So once you figure out who's going to apply it, and I always recommend starting with a smaller group until you can get your procedure going, teaching the technique, doing ongoing education, and then doing your annual competency is really important. From there, when to place it. And every place has a little bit of a different policy. In some places, it's get it on within an hour. Some places get on within 30 minutes. Some places within the first 3 to 6 hours. I really think that if you're doing brain monitoring, you should try to get it on as soon as possible. It is a vital sign of the brain, just like anything else. And I think you need it on as quickly as possible. I think a goal of in the first 30 minutes is probably for most units a little ambitious, but if you've got the right resources, it can happen. So I know in Canada, they are very much committed to getting it on within the first 30 minutes. In the US, I see maybe more like an hour to 2 after admission is more the standard. But certainly 4, 6, 8 hours is just certainly, to me, too far out. So not only important to know when you put them on, but when to take them off. So you need to have a procedure and a policy or kind of a guideline for when you're going to do that as well. And you need to decide how many electrodes. If you're going to use one of those caps, maybe you put on a few extra electrodes and it's almost comparable to doing a full EEG. Or maybe you're just going to be doing 1 or 2 electrodes just to get things started until your tech arrives and then they put on the rest. Deciding how many electrodes is important, and as important also as we're not going to be doing this many, right? We're doing a very simple setup. This is a single channel. So again, a channel is 1 pair of active electrodes. So this is called a biparietal electrode, and this is the ground. So single channel, but most places are doing 2 channels, a left channel and a right channel. And then you still can do a cross cerebral or a biparietal channel. So again, a channel is just a pair of electrodes. And so on this baby, we have a pair on the left, a pair on the right, and then electronically you can create a pair across these 2. And technically you could do a pair here as well. So you could have many channels. Where do we place the sensors? This is a very important question. And so we use what's known as the 10-20 system. And we usually are applying these electrodes over the central and the parietal location. That's the kind of historical way we've been doing it. But some places in Europe are actually doing the frontal parietal. So you may see some people doing that as their channel. So instead of the C central, they're using the F frontal. So they're just doing that to get a larger distance between the electrodes. So this positioning can be, again, biparietal. So it can just be the rear two electrodes. But more commonly, it's bilateral or bilateral is probably the easier way to say it. And so using a pair of electrodes on the left and a pair on the right. So where do we position them? I think the easiest tool to use is really the tool that's available from NATIS, which is just this positioning aid, which is a measuring tape that has letters at the top and letters at the bottom. And you basically place it along the side of the baby's head here where you see this purple line. And then you bring it up until you match the letters at the two anatomical positions. We use the tragus of the ear and the sagittal suture, and we place it along this plane, and then we mark the skin and place the electrodes there. So why do we place the electrodes there? Number one, this central and parietal area is very at risk, especially for hypoxic injury. It's also the area of the brain which seizures migrate through. It's an area of the brain, if you look on this picture on the upper left where you see the skull here, it's the area up here where it has no muscle. And so if you get too low, you get muscle artifact. But placing the electrodes high along this plane, it prevents you getting too much muscle artifact. And again, like I was mentioning, many seizures migrate through the central zone. And so by using just one or two channels and including the central part of the brain, you will actually get most of the baby's seizures, even though you're using limited number of electrodes. So sensor application, we've decided where we're going to place it, how many electrodes we're going to do, and then basically the steps are really the same regardless of the kind of sensor you use. First, you have to choose your site using your measuring tape or whatever other tool you might have. Then cleansing the site, preparing the skin. So if you're doing hydrogels or any of the anything that's not a needle, you're going to have to prep the skin in some way by scrubbing a little bit. You're going to insert if you're using a needle or apply an electrode, depending on if you're using paste or gummy electrodes. And then you're going to secure those sensors and assess the impedance or the quality of signal to make sure that you have a good high quality signal. So how do you place them? First off, you have to avoid all of the debris that is around our babies and all the complicated things like scalp IVs and phototherapy masks and CPAP and other respiratory support devices, and of course hair. These are all things that get in the way of applying electrodes, and you just have to work your way around them the best that you can. This is just a diagram. Again, you find your spots, you cleanse the spot, you put on an electrode, you connect them to your device, you secure them so they don't fall off immediately, and then you make sure you have low impedance. So some of the challenges that we have to neuromonitoring, number one is skin, right? We have our babies there have very fragile skin. We have these devices and these electrodes that may potentially cause injury to the skin, pressure sores and things like that. So we want to be really aware of those, and some of these newer devices help to minimize some of those worries. We also have space issues. All of these devices are just new devices that have to take up space at the bedside. So they're not integrated into our bedside monitors. So they are all individual devices. We may use them sporadically, which means that no one feels that confident in using them. And we have a range of skills in how to read and interpret them and how to use them. So with that, let's take a little plunge into aEEG. I want to make sure by the end of today that you feel really good about how to read aEEG. And so we're going to spend the next few minutes just going through that. And so I thought I might start at the beginning because sometimes people don't really even understand what aEEG really means. So aEEG, and we use the little baby A, not because we use it in babies, but because capital aEEG actually stands for ambulatory EG in the literature. So baby aEEG stands for amplitude integrated EG. And that's when we say aEEG, that's what we mean. So amplitude is really just saying we measure the waves. So it's brain waves, sound waves, California waves, doesn't matter. Waves, amplitude is the measurement of a wave, top to bottom. So how high, how big are my brain waves? Then we integrate, meaning that we take a whole bunch of these brain waves and we integrate them and combine them into a whole. So this is basically trending. So integration is really trending. So amplitude trending of our EEG. And EEG is really waveforms that are collected from surface electrodes, and they are very much dependent on distance and location on the head. So these brain waves have very specific patterns depending on where they are on the head. And distance is very important, and so we want to have consistency in that as well. So those locations, we have specific locations on the head, just like there are specific locations that you would use for getting a 12-lead EKG. On an EEG, a full montage EEG, there are just as many like specifics for that. And our EEG techs are amazing at using these montages. So again, for our babies, we are most frequently using the central and the parietal. And so that's that C and that P. And numbers, they put a little number on the left side of the head, are all odd numbers. So 1s, 3s, 5s, we see them on the left. And then on the right side are all even numbers. So we talk about C3, that's going to be on the central area, the front part of our channel, central, and then 3, the left. P3, parietal, 3 on the left. So those are C3. P3 is a channel that we might monitor on our device. And so for those of you who have worked with the OBM device, you actually see on the actual little amplifier where you plug in your electrodes, it'll say C3, P3, C4, P4. You actually see those actually on there. And that comes just from this naming system that we have for the head. So again, one pair of electrodes is one channel. And when we have one channel, we can then compare that to a second channel. So for us, we're doing 2 pairs, and that makes 2 channels. So left and right. So how do we interpret aEEG? First off, it's important that you realize that the aEEG is always the same. The scale is always 0 at the bottom, 5, 10, and 100. And the paper is always the same. It always has these little gray lines on it. And these little gray lines, or these little hash marks down here, all indicate 10-minute breaks. So these are all 10 minutes to make up an hour, another 10 minutes here to make up an hour. So we always use the scale 0, 5, 10, and 100. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. When we're thinking about interpreting our aEEG, I think it's really important to think about why we're monitoring. And so the infant story can really help us out. Is this a preterm baby who's septic? Is this a term baby who's undergoing hypothermia? Is this a baby who is admitted with metabolic disease who's having seizures? Is this a baby who's having an ALTI or a BRUI at home and we're wanting to see if it's seizures or something else? What's the story behind the baby? Because what this is going to help you realize is what's normal for that baby or what's expected for that baby. And that's the most important thing, right? At the bedside, you just want to know whether or not does this pattern look like what I should expect for this baby. So smaller babies have different types of patterns. We're going to go through those. Babies who are undergoing cooling, who have had issues and OB issues or medications on board, they have different kinds of patterns. And then certainly anti-epileptics and sedation can also play a big part in our patterns. So we want to make sure, okay, what do I expect for this baby's age? And then what do I expect based on some of the other criteria of what I have going on? So after we think of the story, first we're going to then look at some of the background activity. So we're going to look at how strong is the amplitude or those brain waves. And then we're going to look for some patterns that represent cycling or what some people will call sleep-wake cycling, but definitely a pattern of change. So how do we classify aEEG? This is cut off, sorry. It says voltage limits or pattern recognition. And we're going to spend most of our time on voltage because the patterns, although they're easy enough to pick up, they take a little time. And it's much like learning the cardiac patterns or some of the arrhythmias that we maybe have studied in ACLS or something like that. But this is so much easier, I promise. With aEEG, there are only 5 basic patterns. 5 patterns, that's it. That's all we have to really learn. And you can, over time, get used to these shapes of these patterns, the features of these patterns, and name them just by looking at them and not even paying much attention to the voltage parameters. But I think that some of the easiest parts for us to do is really to use voltage. And because that way we can use this scale that we see here, that 0, 5, 10, and 100, we can actually use that to help guide us. And so you can see here that the way that we figure out the upper and the lower margins, that's the top and the bottom edge of our aEEG is to actually trace it visually with your eye. So where that red line is, that's that upper margin. The yellow line, that's our lower margin. And we see here that we have 0, 5, and 10, and the 100. Remember, those are the same scale over and over again. So how does this EEG become aEEG? It transforms it. The actual computer algorithm transforms the feature, the amplitude feature, because there are many other features of the EEG that we don't pay any attention to, but these features turn into aEEG. So we start out with an EEG signal, an EEG graph that just goes up, down, up, down, up, down, up, down. It's positive and it's negative. And the first thing that the device does is makes all these little negatives positive. They call this rectification. So that rectification happens, it makes everything negative positive, and so all of the waves are positive. Then it goes through and it says, what are my highest peaks? What are my lowest peaks? And it tries to measure my max voltage and my min voltage. So maximum and minimum voltage. And then every 15 seconds, it takes those maxes and those mins and it compresses it. So every little line that you see on aEEG really represents 15 seconds of EEG. Amplitude, that was integrated. So amplitude integrated, right? And it's plotted on this semi-logarithmic scale. And the semi-logarithmic scale might sound complicating, but it is actually super cool and very helpful for our babies because they spend so much time in lower voltages, especially as they're small. So semi-logarithmic. So from 0 to 10, the scale is linear. This means that there is equal distance between 0 and 1, 1 and 2, 2 and 3, 3 and 4, 4 and 5, all the way up to 10. So we can easily tell the difference between 4 or 9. We can tell where we are. When we get above 10, it's logarithmic. It becomes a little more difficult to say, where is 32? 32, maybe somewhere up here. And so in the logarithmic space, what we usually just say is greater than 10, greater than 25, greater than 50, or less than 50. So that's what we usually say, because we can't be really specific when we get to logarithmic. So the thing I want you to notice is that there is equal distance between 0 and 10 and 100. So there is so much detail in the lower voltage range. And this is really helpful for us when we're evaluating the health of our baby's brains. The paper is the same. Remember I said it's the same on every device. Doesn't matter if it's a paper or a digital device, which there are really no paper devices anymore. And it's written at a slow paper speed because these were originally paper devices. And they say they're called 6 centimeters per hour is what you'll see. So it's a very, very slow speed. And just like I showed before, these little yellow marks or these little gray lines, 10 minutes spacing. So on one screen, we see 3.5 or 4 hours, depending on how big your screen is. All right, so let's get down to it. So there are really only 5 patterns. And what I want you to realize is there is one pattern that is normal for term babies, one pattern that is normal for preterm babies, and everything else is pretty much abnormal, no matter how old you are. So this makes it so easy to interpret. So let's talk about what's normal for those term babies, or what is a mature aEEG pattern. First off, when we look at our upper margin is above 10. Okay, so let's look here at our patterns. If I can find my mouse, we have the 0, the 5, and the 10, and then you see the 100. So when we're looking at a normal for term babies, the upper margin should always be greater than 10. So we see it here, greater than 10. Then the second feature that we're looking for is the lower margin. And for it to be normal for term babies, we want the lower margin, that's here, to be above 5. Upper margin above 10, lower margin above 5. So here we have an aEEG 0, 5, 10, 100, and we have an upper margin that is definitely above 10, and we have a lower margin that is also definitely above 5. So this is normal. But what is also normal for a term baby is to see cycling. So alternation of the band, and we'll talk a little bit more about that here in a minute. So here we have an aEEG, again, 0, 5, 10. We have our upper margin greater than 10. And we have our lower margin that is usually above 5, except for about every hour, it goes and shifts itself down below 5. But in a very nice normal pattern like this, we love to see this because that is normal cycling, and some people will call this sleep-wake cycling. So when we talk about sleep-wake cycling, these areas where the band drifts down low below the 5, we consider this a quiet sleep or a non-REM sleep cycle. And then we see the pattern become more continuous, which means that the lower margin lifts above 5. And they consider this either an awake state or an active REM sleep. And then we go back into that deep sleep and then coming back up. So these are things that we're looking for on our patterns all the time. So we're looking for a normal background and we're looking for sleep cycling. All right, so what about our preterm babies? Well, you can see that our preterm babies should still have an upper margin above 10. So here's our 0, our 5, and our 10, and we should still expect to see the upper edge above the 10. But because they're little, we allow their lower margin to be below 5. But what we love to see is variability at the baseline. We don't want it to just be all low and flat. We like to see variability at that baseline, even though the lower margin sits mostly below 5. But we also know is that as they age, their aEEG pattern ages and their background becomes more and more like the term baby. So with that example we just saw, we saw the upper margin, so this 25 weeker, we see the upper margin is still above 10, the lower margin is below 5. There are periods of variability, but no sleep-wake cycling really. By 30 weeks, we definitely see the upper margin above 10. The lower margin is still below 5, but we still see variability, and we see periods where the lower margin comes above 5. So we're seeing more and more of that. 35 weeker, almost all above the 5 and above the 10, and then having sleep cycles very visible. So we definitely see changes as the baby matures from week to week. So then let's talk about abnormal. So we have our one normal for our term babies, our one normal for our preterm babies, and what about all of the abnormals for our babies who are younger or are sick? We can think about that upper margin greater than 10, lower margin greater than 5. This still holds for our babies as well. Oops, what happened there? So again, this is normal. And then let's talk about this one here. So we have our upper margin is greater than 10. We see this lower margin is less than 5. So if this was a term baby, is this what we would expect? So if you go into your little panel, you can say yes or no. If this was a term baby, is this what you would expect? No. Exactly. So if it's a term baby, what would you expect for the lower margin to be? You would want it above 5, exactly. So if this is a term baby and his lower margin is less than 5, what might be some causes? What might be some causes of this? You can text it in. Cooling. So he has HIE, maybe sedation, meds. Exactly. A sedation. Yeah. So Donna's asking, does a sedation affect? Yeah. So morphine, usually about 1 or 2 microvolt changes. Phenobarb, you see sometimes drastic changes, but in general, we see at least a shift downwards in the lower margin for at least 30 or 45 minutes. Phenobarb is one of these meds that, given to a healthy brain, suppresses it for about an hour, and then the brain comes back to baseline. If you have any kind of dysfunction, you give a little bit of phenobarb, even a small test dose of 5 milligrams per kilo, and you will actually see massive suppression. So phenobarb is kind of an interesting one. So yeah, great answers. So what are causes in a term baby for a term baby to have a pattern like this? Some sort of injury or illness, definitely missing those sleep-wake cycles. So we're not seeing those sleep-wake cycles, so that's a little worrisome for a baby this size. So definitely would worry about that. Excuse me, I had a little sneeze there. Definitely worried about this baby's brain and want to be trending it for the next bit of time. So this is what we would call a discontinuous pattern. It's not always as active as we'd like it to be. There are some periods of silence. So these little periods of quiet brain bring this lower margin down lower. And that's really what we're seeing here. What do you think about this particular pattern? Is our upper margin still above 10? What do you guys think? Is upper margin above 10? So remember, we have our scale here, 0, 5, 10. Yeah. So we're definitely seeing our upper margin above 10, but we are seeing our lower margin. What's our lower margin doing? Talk to me a little bit about that. Yeah, exactly. It's very, very low. And there's this abrupt change. I love that you picked up on that abrupt change on the left. Yeah, so something happened funny there, right? So either there was some electrode issue, nobody's marked an event on here, so we're not really sure. Yeah, so it's less than 5 and no variability. I love that description. So these are things we can describe this as nurses in the nursing notes, right? We don't have to say this is a burst suppression pattern and I think it's indicative of a poor outcome. We can literally describe this. The aEEG is on my patient. The aEEG signal is good. The impedance is low. I notice a pattern that has an upper margin of greater than 10, nearing 100 in some points, and the lower margin is less than 5 continuously, and there's low variability. You're just describing what you observe. So yeah, so this pattern, we have this high upper margin, but this very low and flat, very low and flat. And so this is called burst suppression. This has a very classic pattern to it. And there's no baseline variability. It's moderate to severely abnormal. And it's really caused by these high voltage bursts and then these low voltage patterns in the middle. So you see how this goes: burst, suppression, burst, suppression. So the burst goes high, because remember, how many seconds did I say? How many seconds to make one line of aEEG? Do you remember? How many seconds are compressed? Yeah, 15 seconds. So 15 seconds. So it's like in that 15-second period, what was the highest high? What was the lowest low? What was the highest high? What was the lowest low? That's what we see on this monitor. What was the highest high and the lowest low? As burst suppression becomes more severe, you actually see a dropping out of signal, and you see it looks like little brush, like little skyscrapers almost, right? There's space between this because there's space between the brain activity. There are times when there is almost no brain activity. So as it becomes more and more severe, the bursts become further and further apart. The times of suppression becomes longer and longer. That's a severe brain. There are some times when the aEEG will not meet either of our criteria. The upper margin will not be greater than 10 and the lower margin will not be greater than 5. So let's look at a couple of those situations. So do we see it here? How high is our upper margin here? What do you guys think? About 8? Yeah, upper margin about 8. So we know that cutoff for normal, the upper margin should be greater than 10. Yeah, so just, Kim, you're doing great, less than 10. My upper margin is just less than 10. That's a great descriptor. Oops, that's really teeny. Now we have this one. This is an isoelectric or a flat tracing. Now we have an upper and a lower margin that are both less than 5. Really low, really flat. We call this inactive, or we can call it flat. And in the literature, they call it flat. Clinically, most people call it inactive. So now that we've looked at background, we've looked at the presence of sleep, then we can do a couple other things. We can look for symmetry. So if you can see here, let me move some of these little things around so you can see them. So you can see here that we have an asymmetrical pattern. So here we have kind of symmetry happening. So let me close some of these. We have symmetry here where we have this upper margin moving along for the most part right above the 10. Same over here, upper margin hanging around right at the 10. And then we have the lower margin less than 5 on both sides. And then we look at this one. It's crazy, right? Look at the left. It's like practically flat. And then we have this side. It's moving along, variability at the baseline, very asymmetrical here. There can be many causes of this. Some of it can be true brain. What would be some causes of asymmetrical brain activity? What would be some possibilities of that? What are some things that might cause asymmetrical? Electrode placement, yep, definitely. So problems with dislodged. Might have a stroke, yep, absolutely. A lot of edema, some places we might see edema. But yeah, electrode displacement is the #1 thing we want to look for. And then there can be truly cerebral problems as well, like stroke. So this is a picture of a doll baby's head where you can see the symmetry of the electrodes. So I just want to, again, talk about the space between the electrodes is very important, and we need to have symmetrical spacing on both sides. When we have electrodes that are very close together on one side, we're going to end up having a very dampened signal. When we have electrodes that are very far apart, we have a bigger signal. And so we want to have them symmetrical so that we can be able to tell what's really going on. This is an example that happened to a baby that was in a unit where I was, where the electrodes were actually touching. And this caused this dampening on the left. And then it's a miracle. They fixed it. And then there's the electrodes there, all fixed on this side. And the brain went right back to normal. Very symmetrical pattern. But while the electrodes were touching, we had a very asymmetrical pattern. So again, a stroke can certainly be a cause, a very sad cause of asymmetrical aEEG, but the injured side of the brain will cause a very dampened EEG signal. That dampened EEG will result in a dampened aEEG. So we can definitely see that from that as well. Then there's stability. So if we have a pattern and when we have aEEG on, we normally are keeping aEEG on for days and days at times. And so we want to check out what the stability is of the pattern over time, and we want the pattern to improve. And so sometimes we can see changes to our aEEG in minutes. Do you see this change? This was a 27-weeker, and I came in to look at his aEEG, and he had this fantastic looking pattern. Lots of variability, you know, great looking pattern for a 27-weeker. And then, oh my goodness, something happened right here that completely flattened out this aEEG. Any guesses to what happened? Some of you have seen this slide before. A bleed, oversedation, Ativan, yeah, surfactant. These are all very good. Yeah, so surfactant can cause a very transient suppression, usually about 20 to 30 minutes. This was a case of a single dose of an appropriate dose of Ativan. So benzos can have a very marked effect on neuron firing. So we want to be very careful with these medications. And then you can see in this pattern, this was him 24 hours later. And this is 48 hours later. So these impacts, and he got one more dose of morphine in between. So it can be quite suppressed for quite a long time. Changes can also happen post-cooling or babies who have HIE, so it's important to watch them. So what do you think about this pattern on day of life 1? You like this pattern? Don't like this pattern. Is it good? It's bad. Exactly. We don't even have to really even get any more detailed than that. It's very bad. It's very flat. It is very inactive. And then we have this baby's pattern at day 3 of life. What do you think about that one? Is it better or is it worse? It's improving. It's better. Is it what we expect for a term baby? It's not what we expect for a term baby. Yeah, no, not yet. No. But we're waiting, right? It's still below 5. Yeah, the upper margin still below 5. Exactly. And then here we are 7 days after rewarming. What do you guys think about this pattern? Yeah, hooray. Love that, Kim. It's better. It looks good. So is the upper margin greater than 10? Lower margin greater than 5? Do we see sleep patterns? Yes, yes, yes. So these are all reassuring things that we're looking for. And what we know is that those babies who achieve a normal background pattern in the first 2 days, so not after rewarming, but during rewarm or during cooling by 48 hours, those babies have the best outcomes. And so this is a paper by Mariana Thorenson that actually goes through and looks at the time to get to a continuous trace, that's with a bottom margin greater than 5, or at least a discontinuous pattern where you have variability of the baseline, but not quite greater than 5. And they looked at babies who were in the non-cooled group. So they actually were, this was a study done through the Toby trial that was in the UK looking at cooling, and they did aEEG for all these babies. And the babies in red are all the babies who were normothermic. And then the blue babies were all the hypothermic babies. The babies who had good outcomes, who were being cooled, all regained a normal pattern by 48 hours. All the babies who had a good outcome, who did not get cooled, returned to normal trace by 24 hours. So before hypothermia, we looked for a return of normal pattern by 24 hours. But cooling slows down everything. So it also cools down when we recover that background pattern. That the babies that are the starred babies are the babies who died. The ones that have the filled in circles or triangles are the babies who had poor outcomes. That there were some babies who did regain a normal pattern in that period who were not being cooled. The babies who died, all up here, never gained a normal trace again. And for the cooling babies, they also made, some of them, 5 of them, did regain a normal pattern. 3 of them before 48, 2 of them after 48 hours. The others, again, who had poor outcomes or never regained normal trace, many of them died. So normal background pattern is very helpful in predicting outcome for babies who are undergoing therapeutic hypothermia for HIE. A group from the US, Ann Massaro and her group at Children's in DC, they were actually looking at this as well. They found the same things. Babies who had a good outcome had recovery. Those babies who had death or adverse outcome had no recovery, or had minimal normalization. They also found the same for sleep-wake cycling, the return of sleep-wake cycling. Dr. Thorensen found the same. Babies who had a return of sleep-wake patterns by day 4 had no adverse outcomes. So just again saying that what is normal, we need to have a normal background, but we also need to have sleep-wake cycling. Those are very predictive for long-term outcome. So again, we looked at our preemies and how they can change over weeks. So this is why we might do serial aEEGs on our preterm babies and look at their maturation over time. This is just some papers that are from 2012, Wickstrom, looking at background patterns for aEEG in preterms. So if you're interested in looking at the preterms, basically showing that babies who had a better background score, even during their first 72 hours of life, showed that they had the best outcomes at 2 years. There's a lot of data around preterms and their use for that. Predicting outcomes in preterms, again, in neonates in general, for asphyxiated babies, we know that aEEG is a very heavy predictor for them. And for moderately preterm babies, we have great early predictive value, especially the first 72 hours of life in our preterms. So same for our cooling babies, right? That first 48 hours, our preemies that first 72 hours. So we've looked at stability, symmetry, background, sleep, and the last is seizures. And just to give you a little background on that, seizures are repetitive spike wave patterns. They have a beginning, a middle, and an end, and they can be superimposed on normal patterns. Babies can have normal background and have seizures. They can also be continuous, or what we would call status. And we can see that they have a characteristic pattern on aEEG as well. So when I say they have a beginning, a middle, and an end, I'm just gonna play these 5 little slides pretty quick here so you can see them. They start out small. You can see the EEG on the bottom, and you see it get a little bit bigger and a little bit bigger, and then it goes away. So the seizures have a crescendo, decrescendo. This is a very awful aEEG, very flat background, and very big seizures interrupting this background about every 10 minutes. So these are very big seizures on an otherwise silent brain. We can have single seizures that are unilateral in nature. So this is a seizure that's coming around on the right side. We see an upper margin still greater than 10, a lower margin less than 5, and then we have this massive uprising. Seizures are high voltage activity, high amplitude. High amplitude makes your band go up. So that makes you see the band go thin, and arch makes an archway. It interrupts it with this high voltage signal. We can also have repetitive seizures. How many seizures do you see on this pattern on the right-hand side? Can you count them? How many do you think? 3 at least? Yeah, 3 at least. Anybody else? Any guesses? So here's an uprising here, pretty big. We also see a small interruption here. This is this little red line. Yeah, Tessa's saying 8 maybe. So this red line is actually where we've taken the actual aEEG and we've then opened it up. Oops, opened it up. And what we're looking for is spiky rhythm and for greater than 10 seconds. And this fills the whole 10 seconds and probably the left and the right sides as well. So yeah, it's a lot of seizures in here. And then they go away and there might be an area here you'd want to look at. But what I really like to see is the upper and the lower margin shift upwards. You can see these peaks and valleys, and that's how I feel more suspicious about those areas, for sure. This is status epilepticus. So you see this just constant interruption, peaks and valleys, peaks and valleys, peaks and valleys. Constant interruption of the background pattern is just status epilepticus. But not everything that has an uprising is really a seizure. So I just want to make sure that I show you these things. So each device has impedance, and so impedance warning. So you always want to be looking for your impedance values, making sure that those are good. And then we also want to be looking for other kinds of funny artifacts. Remember I talked about muscle artifact. If our electrodes get too close to the muscle on the side of the head, we might see this fast and fuzzy. And we see this with shivering babies. We see this with crying babies, babies who are sucking on a pacifier. If we get the electrodes too close to those muscles, we sometimes see that happening. The other kinds of artifacts we might see are things like heart rate artifact. So sometimes, especially with needle electrodes, we might pick up little bits of heart rate. You can see these little ECG notches in here, so you can see those. So we might see that. You might see electrode popping. This is very rare, but I have seen it a couple times where it just pops up all the way to the top and it's just this very thick band and it just pops and goes off. So sometimes it's electrode connection. You see it more with cups than you do with the needles or the hydrogels. We see babies moving all the time. So movement artifacts are something that we see frequently. So just to be aware, you know, there's nothing, there might be a couple spikes, but there's nothing rhythmic to this at all, nothing continuous. High frequency ventilation is a very common artifact. We see that here, and you can see how high up the band is. And so we just have to look at the pattern and just double check. It could be seizure, but this is very high, very similar, and then it just falls off. I see this a lot when a baby turns one side to the other, and you see, you know, this artifact moving around a little bit. So what are some of the limitations to aEEG? Number one, remember how I talked about how seizures have to be, or how the aEEG, it takes 15 seconds to make one line. So if you have a very short seizure that is just 30 seconds or less, you may have a seizure that goes undetected on aEEG. Low voltage seizures, especially if you have a normal background, it's going to be almost impossible to pick that up because they're just mixed in there with all the normal stuff that's happening. And then a focal seizure, that's in an area outside of where we're monitoring. So remember, we're only putting electrodes on that left and right side and right on that little area. What if the seizure is frontal or occipital in nature and it doesn't migrate out through the whole head? So we want to make sure that we are just aware of the limitations, and that's why we still want to get our continuous EEGs when we can. So for us at the bedside, I really want to just focus in on the things that I think that are most important for us as nurses to be working with, or if you're in another role that you can make sure that the training happens for those nurses. Number one is to focus on what's normal for the age or for the disease state. So remembering that we want that upper margin greater than 10, lower margin greater than 5. If you're a term baby, that's where we want, that's what's normal. We want to focus on that. We want to focus on looking for suspicious patterns, areas that might tell us that there are seizures, so that we can notify someone to look at that. So we want to look for these unusual uprisings that have a beginning, a middle, and an end, this crescendo, decrescendo, and that have a very spike wave pattern that lasts for more than 10 seconds. We want to focus on that symmetry. We want to make sure that we have good spacing between our electrodes and that we see good symmetry between our right and left hemispheres of our brains. And we want to make sure that we have a criteria for notifying people when things change from baseline. So of course, you can look at this pattern and you can say, OMG, what happened to this pattern? So just if you walked up, what would you think? What are some of the things that might have caused this abrupt change? What are some of the troubleshooting that you might do? So go ahead and text in and tell me what you think. For those of you watching the recording, I'll read what they say. What do you think that this could cause this drastic change? Medication. Yeah, medication. Yeah, Ativan, right? We're all afraid of Ativan now. Lead displacement. Good call, Katie. Yeah. This one, the needle fell out. It's actually the real deal that happened on this one. Yeah, good job. But yeah, these are all possibilities. So we've spent some time together talking about these first two of our 4 pillars. And so we're going to end with that. And then of course, I'll take questions if you have specific questions on brain monitoring, but thank you all for being here and being a part of our Every NICU is a Neuro-NICU webinar. I'm happy to answer questions. We have a little bit of time left, and I think I'll just end there for the content for today. Thank you, Sharon. So if anybody has a question, otherwise I'll be hopeful that I see you all next Monday, where we can continue this and then start to talk about how do you break down some of these ideas. What are the areas that you've identified from your practice, your hospital's practice, right? Because this only matters where you work, right? What are you gonna do in your place is the only thing that really matters, right? You have to look at what your practice is and then decide what's the most important thing that you want to change. Do you guys have some ideas? What are some things that have intrigued you from today's presentation that you might want to consider either measuring, that you were like, I wonder if we're doing that as well as we could do that? Or what can I do better? What are we doing, but we're not doing as well as we could? Maybe you're using aEEG, but you're not getting it on within an hour. Maybe it's taking too long. So Kim is saying the iPad. Katie's saying maybe some of the scoring tools. Great, thanks. Yeah, I think some of these scoring tools are really measuring what we're really doing. Awesome. Anybody else have any questions? Mock codes. Ooh, I like that. Mock codes for positioning. We're going to talk more about cooling next time, but I think mock codes for cooling, that admitting the HIE kids, I think that's a really important drill. Especially if you're in a smaller unit and you're not going to have these kids walking through, measuring the idea of getting how long it takes to get on aEEG after the order. Yeah. So you have the order. So if you've convinced somebody to do aEEG, and how long does it take? I think it is until you start measuring it, I think you might not know. This is great. I'm not sure that all the chat pops up on the recording. Yeah, ongoing education for placement of electrodes. Yeah, again, if you don't use it often, you might forget how to do it. These are great ideas. Any other questions? All right, you all. Thanks again for being with me and for participating and giving your little votes and all that. We'll see you next week on Monday. Anyways, thanks for being with me, and I hope that you guys all have a great night wherever you are. And thanks again for joining, and I'll see you next time. All right, that wraps up part 2 of our series of Every NICU is a NeuroNICU. I hope you enjoyed the review of aEEG. I hope you either learned a few new things or solidified your knowledge and your confidence in reading aEEG tracings. And if you want the workbook, click the link in the show notes or here on the screen. So I'll see you next week for week 3, where we'll be talking about neuroprotective strategies. If you want to be notified when the sessions go live, hit the like button and subscribe so that YouTube knows that you want to see more of our content. Thanks. Bye.